World War II is often remembered as a European tragedy. Names like Hitler, Berlin, and Auschwitz dominate the way the story is told for many people. That is where the horror begins and where it ends. But history is rarely that simple. While Europe was burning, another catastrophe was unfolding across Asia. It claimed millions of lives, erased entire communities, and reshaped the future of nations. Yet for many viewers today, this chapter of World War II feels distant, unclear, or barely mentioned at all. This is not a story meant to shock, and it is not told to provoke hatred or assign blame to modern generations. It is told to understand what happened, why it mattered, and why silence surrounded it for so long. To understand this story, we have to rewind to the early 1930s. At that time, Japan was not the peaceful country many people associate with today. It was a rapidly expanding empire led by military leaders who believed that survival depended on conquest. Japan lacked natural resources, faced population pressure, and feared being boxed in by Western colonial powers. In 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, a region in northern China. The goal was straightforward: land, resources, and strategic control. This invasion was not a spontaneous event. It was a calculated move, supported by military leadership and justified as a matter of national survival. From there, Japan's ambitions continued to grow. Japanese leaders promoted a vision known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. On the surface, it promised cooperation, shared growth, and liberation from Western domination. But historians largely agree that in practice, it served as a cover for occupation, exploitation, and control as Japanese forces moved deeper into China, Korea, and later Southeast Asia. Reports of violence followed. Villages were emptied, crops were seized, local populations were treated not as civilians but as obstacles. By the late 1930s, the conflict had escalated into full-scale war in China. In December 1937, Japanese forces captured the city of Nanjing, then the capital of China. What followed became one of the most documented and controversial episodes of the war. Over the course of several weeks, hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were killed, according to many historical estimates. Survivor accounts describe mass executions, widespread sexual violence, and systematic destruction. These events were not buried in secret archives. Some Japanese newspapers at the time even reported acts of violence, though often framed as military achievement. Decades later, historians would debate the exact numbers, but few would dispute the scale of suffering. And Nanjing was not an isolated incident across occupied territories. Civilian life was treated as expendable. Food supplies were redirected to support the military. Leaving local populations vulnerable to starvation, forced labor became routine. People were transported to work camps, factories, and construction sites under brutal conditions. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded camps and villages, stripped of medical care for many civilians. Survival depended on chance rather than protection. One of the darkest chapters uncovered by researchers involves a secret biological research program known as Unit 731, operating primarily in occupied China. This unit conducted human experiments on prisoners. Men, women, and even children were deliberately exposed to deadly diseases, so researchers could observe how illness spread and how the body failed. These experiments violated every known principle of medical ethics and warfare. After the war, the controversy deepened. Some individuals connected to Unit 731 were never put on trial, partly because their research data was considered valuable by foreign governments. During the early Cold War, this decision remains one of the most criticized choices made in the post-war period. Another painful subject that continues to shape international relations is the system known as comfort women. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied regions were forced into military brothels. Many were taken through deception, coercion, or outright abduction. They lived under constant abuse, isolation, and control for decades after the war. Survivors struggled to be heard. Some governments denied responsibility. Others minimized the scale or nature of the system. For those women, the fight was never about revenge. It was about recognition, truth, and dignity. Now, this is where the story becomes more complicated. At the center of Japan during this era stood Emperor Hirohito. He ruled for more than 60 years, including the entire World War II period. Unlike Hitler or Mussolini, Hirohito was never put on trial after the war. He remained emperor until his death in 1989. So what was his role after the war? Hirohito stated that he was largely a symbolic figure, with limited control over military decisions. This explanation was accepted by occupying authorities at the time, especially as the Cold War began and political stability became a priority, however. Later research painted a more complex picture. Historical records show that Hirohito attended military briefings, approved operations, and was regularly informed about the war's progress. While historians continue to debate the extent of his responsibility, many agree that he was not entirely powerless. The Tokyo trials, Japan's equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, did prosecute several military leaders. Some were executed. Others were imprisoned, but no member of the imperial family was charged. That decision had long-term consequences. It shaped how the war was remembered inside Japan and how it was discussed internationally. It also influenced education, public memory, and diplomatic relations across Asia. Now let's talk about numbers carefully and responsibly. Scholars estimate that between 10 and 20 million civilians across Asia died as a result of Japanese military actions, occupation policies, famine, and disease in China alone. Estimates range from 15 to 20 million deaths connected to the war in Indonesia. Millions are believed to have died due to food shortages caused by occupation policies. In the Philippines, large numbers of civilians were killed during battles and reprisals. Numbers can feel cold, but behind every number was a real person. A farmer, a child, a family trying to survive one more day. So why isn't this discussed as widely as the Holocaust in Europe? There are several reasons. After the war, the United States focused on rebuilding Japan as a strong ally against the Soviet Union. Political stability was prioritized over prolonged trials or deep public reckoning. Education also plays a role. In Germany, the Holocaust is taught extensively. Memorials stand across the country. Denial is illegal. In Japan, coverage of wartime actions varies widely. Some textbooks mention these events briefly, others avoid detail altogether. This difference in education shapes how societies remember the past. None of this means modern Japan is defined by these crimes. Today's Japan is a peaceful country, shaped by generations born long after the war. But history does not disappear simply because it is uncomfortable in China and Korea. Memories of occupation remain part of national identity. Political tensions often resurface when historical wounds feel ignored or minimized. This brings us to the real challenge. How do you talk about mass suffering without turning history into a competition? How do you honor victims without creating new divisions? Historians argue that honest acknowledgement is the only way forward. Remembering the Holocaust in Europe does not erase suffering in Asia, and recognizing Asian victims does not diminish Jewish suffering. History is not a scoreboard. It is a warning when stories fade, patterns repeat, dehumanization, blind obedience, power without limits. These are not problems locked in the past. They reappear whenever people stop questioning authority and stop caring about those labeled as others. Hirohito's legacy remains complex in Japan. He is remembered by many as a symbol of continuity outside Japan. He is often viewed through the lens of unanswered questions. History may never deliver a single verdict that everyone agrees on, but silence is not neutrality. Silence shapes memory. What matters most is not who history condemns, but what history teaches. Millions of Asian civilians suffered and died during World War II. Their stories deserve space, respect, and honesty. Not to stir anger, but to remind us what unchecked power can do. If learning the parts of history you are never taught matters to you, keep watching.